At exactly 9:17 a.m., the door to my lake cabin exploded open, slamming against a log wall so hard a framed photograph of my late grandfather fell and shattered. Glass sprayed across hardwood floors like crystalline rain, each shard catching morning sunlight, streaming through windows that overlooked Lake Ashbury's glassy surface. In March, Karen Whitmore, HOA president of Lakeshore Estates, her designer heels stabbing into my floors with the rhythm of an executioner's drumbeat. She clutched her clipboard like a weapon, knuckles white with rage, face glowing crimson, voice trembling with manufacturer authority that filled the room like poison gas. Mr. Lawson, you are in direct violation of Subdivision Code Section 8.2, subsection D, and are hereby subject to immediate seizure property under emergency HOA powers. Her words came fast, sharp, desperate. The sound of someone who believed their own lies so deeply they'd forgotten what truth sounded like. What she didn't realize, what made the U.S. District Judge sitting calmly across from me at my kitchen table raise one deeply amused eyebrow, was that I had spent the last 6 months meticulously documenting every illegal act her HOA had committed, every forged signature, every fraudulent fine, every trespassing incident, captured in high-definition video and organized in color-coded binders that now sat between Judge Harold Simmons and his morning coffee. The very federal agency she thought would help her destroy me was about to indict her for wire fraud, mail fraud, and conspiracy to commit extortion. The metallic click of FBI agents' footsteps on my porch steps echoed like a countdown to justice. Karen's eyes darted toward the door, then back to the judge, confusion and panic finally cracking through her armor of entitlement. "What would you do?" I said, voice calm as a lake outside my window. "If the woman who's tormented you for months, who's tried to steal your family's legacy, who's filed dozens of false charges against you, stormed into your home while you're sitting across from the federal judge investigating her crimes. Let me rewind 6 months and tell you exactly how we got here. How a 49-year-old marine electrician with callous hands and his grandfather's cabin became the target of a criminal conspiracy. How I fought back against a HOA dictator who thought her clipboard was more powerful than the law. This is my story. And trust me, you won't believe how it ends. My name's Ethan Lawson, 49 years old, marine electrician by trade, son of a commercial fisherman, and proud grandson of Frank Lawson, the man who built this cabin in 1958 with nothing but hand tools, determination, and a dream of creating something that would outlast him. The property sits on the eastern shore of Lake Ashbury, surrounded by 40 acres of pristine wilderness where towering pines whisper secrets to the wind and loons sing their haunting calls at dusk. The water here runs so clear you can see 20 feet down to where sunfish dart between ancient rocks that have witnessed a century of seasons changing. My grandfather carved every beam of this cabin by hand, one nail at a time, during summers when he wasn't out on fishing boats, pulling nets heavy with salmon and halibut. The logs still bear the marks of his craftsmanship. Precise notches that fit together like puzzle pieces. Sealed with mixture he created himself that's kept this structure standing through 66 winters of mountain storms and summer heat. After 20 years of wiring oil rigs in the North Sea and installing electrical systems on ferries that cross the Puget Sound in weather that would make grown men weep, I came home burned out, divorced, and desperate for the kind of peace I remember from childhood summers spent here with my grandfather. I bought out my siblings' shares of the inheritance. My sister Sarah got the Seattle house, my brother David took the fishing boat, and this place became mine completely. My dream was beautifully simple. Fix up the old dock that sagged with age, rent out kayaks to tourists who wanted to explore the lake's hidden coves, and live quietly in the place where I'd learned to fish, to build, to breathe. For one perfect year, that's exactly what I did. The morning smelled of wet cedar and engine oil, coffee brewing in my grandfather's ancient percolator, bacon sizzling on a cast-iron skillet older than I am. The only sounds were wind through the trees, water lapping at the dock, an occasional float plane landing on the far side of the lake, where the resort catered to city folks with more money than sense. I'd wake at dawn, check the weather, prep the kayaks, then spend hours rewiring the cabin's electrical system that my grandfather had installed before regulations existed. Honest work, peaceful days. Exactly what my grandfather had wanted when he built this place as a refuge from the chaos of modern life. That piece ended the day the HOA moved and across the ridge. Lakeshore Estates, they called it. 47 McMansions built by a development company from California that bought the old Morrison Ranch, clear-cut 15 acres of forest, and erected monuments to suburban excess, houses with 4-car garages, pristine lawns that required industrial amounts of water and chemicals, and HOA covenants thicker than the Bible. The day they broke ground, I watched from my dock as bulldozers tore into earth that had never known anything but wildflowers and deer trails. I should have known then that trouble was coming. But I was naive enough to believe that my property, separate and predating their development by 60 years, would be left alone. I was wrong. Karen Whitmore, 47 years old, but fighting it with enough Botox and plastic surgery to stock a medical supply warehouse. Platinum blonde hair lacquered into place with products that probably violated environmental regulations. Former realtor turned current self-proclaimed guardian of community standards and property values. Phrases she wielded like weapons against anyone who didn't meet her impossibly narrow definition of acceptable. She arrived on my dock uninvited on the first truly warm morning of spring, stepping carefully in designer heels completely inappropriate for weatherwood planks, clipboard tucked under her arm like a shield, pearls flashing in the morning sun like shark teeth ready to bite. The sharp click of her heels on my dock announced her approach long, before I looked up from replacing a corroded electrical junction box on my kayak rental shed. She carried herself with the confidence of someone who'd spent years telling other people what to do and expected immediate compliance. "Mr. Lawson," she announced without introduction, voice carrying that particular tone rich people use when addressing those they consider beneath them. "I'm Karen Whitmore, president of the Lakeshore Estates Homeowners Association. I need to inform you that all waterfront properties within our jurisdiction are required to maintain a uniform aesthetic standard as outlined in our Community Covenant Section 4, subsection 7. I straightened up, wiping grease from my hands onto my work jeans, and actually laughed. Not politely. I genuinely thought she was joking. "Ma'am, this cabin's been here since Eisenhower was president. You just built your development 2 years ago. I'm not in your HOA, never signed anything, and my property predates your rules by 6 decades. Her smile froze on her face like ice forming on a winter lake. The temperature dropped 10 degrees despite the warm sunshine. "Mr. Lawson, I don't think you understand how these things work. The Lakeshore Estates Covenant covers all waterfront parcels in this quadrant. Your structure creates visual blight that impacts property values for our residents who invested considerable sums in their homes. My structure, I could feel my blood pressure rising. My grandfather built this cabin with his own hands. It's been in my family longer than you've been alive, and I'm not part of your HOA, so your rules don't apply to me." She pulled a document from her clipboard with the flourish of a magician, revealing a trick. "According to recently updated county boundary assessments, your parcel is contiguous with our development's waterfront designation. You'll be receiving formal documentation very soon. Have a lovely day, Mr. Lawson." She turned on her heel and walked back down my dock, her Escalade waiting on the dirt road, engine running, wasting gas while she delivered her threats. I watched her drive away, the dust from her departure settling slowly in the morning air, and felt the first cold touch of dread settling in my stomach. The next day, an envelope appeared nailed, literally nailed with a 3-inch galvanized spike, to my front door. Inside, printed on official-looking letterhead with the Lakeshore Estates logo, was a citation, $1,500 fine for non-compliant exterior materials creating aesthetic disharmony, and unapproved dock structures violating waterfront uniformity standards. The document threatened property liens, legal action, and enforcement measures as deemed necessary by the HOA board if I didn't comply within 30 days. I stood there holding that paper, feeling the weight of what was coming, and realized that Karen Whitmore had just declared war. She'd picked the wrong cabin, the wrong man, and the wrong legacy to mess with, but she didn't know that yet. It began. Within a month, the HOA launched what I came to call Operation Bleed Him Dry, a systematic campaign of financial harassment designed to force me to either comply or sell. The fines arrived with military precision, each one delivered in a crisp white envelope with the Lakeshore Estates logo embossed in gold. $300 fine for parking my work truck in a manner visible from adjacent properties. My own driveway. $500 fine for noise pollution exceeding community standards. The sound of my generator during routine electrical repairs at 2 p.m. on a Wednesday. $1,000 fine for unauthorized commercial activity without proper business permits. Because I rented out 2 kayaks through a simple Facebook post of tourists wanting to explore the lake. Each fine came with increasingly threatening language about property liens, foreclosure proceedings, and the HOA's legal obligation to maintain community standards through all available enforcement mechanisms. The letters were signed by Karen in sweeping cursive, with HOA President, underlined twice as if the emphasis made her authority more legitimate. But the paper warfare was just the beginning. Karen escalated to bureaucratic sabotage with the precision of someone who'd done this before. She filed a complaint with the county planning department claiming my dock extended beyond my property line onto HOA-controlled shoreline. Completely false, but enough to trigger an investigation that stalled all my business permits for 3 months. My kayak rental income dried up overnight while inspectors scheduled and rescheduled site visits that somehow never quite happened. Then the physical harassment started. One morning I woke to find my security lights shot out, the bulbs shattered by what looked like pellet gun damage. Tire tracks scarred my lawn, deep gouges where someone had deliberately driven to my flower beds. The same wildflowers my grandfather had planted 60 years ago. My mail started disappearing, important documents vanishing from my mailbox only to show up days later torn and muddied on my doorstep. The mechanical hum of Karen's white Escalade idling at my property line became the soundtrack of my mornings. She'd parked there for hours, sometimes with passengers I couldn't quite see through the tinted windows, watching my cabin like a stalker studying prey. My trail cameras caught footage of her taking photographs of my property from every angle, documenting violations that existed only in her manufactured reality. Each fine came with a letter threatening lien placement and property seizure, the language escalating from advisory notice to final warning to imminent enforcement action. The total mounted faster than I could track. $1,500, then $3,200, then $7,800, then $12,400. By the end of the second month, the HOA claimed I owed them $38,000 in fines, penalties, and administrative processing fees. I knew this was war, but not the kind fought with fists or angry confrontations. This was warfare waged through paperwork, bureaucracy, and the slow, grinding machinery of systems that favor those with money and connections over those with justice on their side. Late one night, I sat at my grandfather's hand-built table, surrounded by threatening letters and legal documents I barely understood, and realized Karen was counting on me to do exactly what she wanted: give up, sell the cabin to some developer who'd tear it down and replace it with another generic mansion. Let her win through sheer exhaustion and financial pressure. The smell of diesel and pine sap mixed with my growing rage as I stared at those letters. My grandfather had fought through the Great Depression, World War II, and decades of backbreaking work to build this place. He'd survived storms that had sunk fishing boats, economic crashes that had destroyed fortunes, and the slow march of progress that had paved over half the wilderness he'd loved. I'd be damned if I let some HOA dictator with a clipboard destroy what he'd built. That night, I made a decision. If Karen wanted war, she'd get war. But we'd fight it on my terms with my weapons, documentation, patience, and the laws she was so busy breaking. I bought my first security camera the next morning. By the end of the week, I had 8 cameras covering every angle of my property, recording in high definition with cloud backup, time-stamped and archived. Every future trespass, every harassment, every illegal act would be captured and saved. Karen had picked a fight with a marine electrician who understood systems, who knew how to troubleshoot problems, and who had inherited his grandfather's stubborn refusal to quit. The real battle was just beginning. I started digging into the HOA's foundation the way I'd troubleshoot a faulty electrical system, methodically, patiently, following each wire back to its source until I found the short circuit. The county clerk's office occupied a dimly lit basement that smelled like mildew, old paper, and decades of bureaucratic neglect. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting sickly green illumination across rows of filing cabinets that stretched back into shadows. The clerk, a weathered woman named Martha, who'd worked there for 33 years, watched me with the weary patience of someone who'd seen every type of property dispute imaginable. "Looking for HOA founding documents?" she asked, already pulling a key ring from her desk drawer. "You're the third person this year asking about Lakeshore Estates. That woman's made herself some enemies." 3 hours of digging through dusty files revealed what Karen clearly didn't expect anyone to check: the actual legal boundaries of the HOA's jurisdiction. The Lakeshore Estates Charter, filed in 2021, claimed authority over all contiguous waterfront parcels within the designated development zone, as mapped in Exhibit A, attached here too. But when I pulled Exhibit A and laid it next to historical survey maps dating back to 1958, the truth became crystal clear. My property wasn't contiguous with their development. There was a 20-foot strip of state-owned buffer zone, protected wetland designated by the Department of Natural Resources in 1987, sitting directly between my eastern property line and the nearest HOA parcel. Legally, they had zero authority over my land, zero jurisdiction. Their entire campaign of harassment was built on a foundation of lies. That night, under the dim light of my kitchen lamp, I spread out maps across my grandfather's table. Survey maps from 1958 showing original property lines. County assessor maps from 1975, 1992, 2008, and 2021. Every single update showed the same undeniable fact. My land was legally independent, separated from the HOA by protected state property they couldn't claim or cross. But something else caught my eye. The HOA's boundary map, filed in 2021, showed lines that extended past the state buffer zone, lines that illegally included my property. When I compared the digital file to the original hand-drawn survey from the county's archive, I saw it. Someone had altered the boundaries, adding my parcel to their jurisdiction without legal authority. More digging revealed something even more damning. The digital survey map filed with the county bore the signature of Robert Chun, a licensed surveyor. But when I called Chen's office, his assistant told me he retired in 2019, 2 years before this survey was supposedly completed and signed. Someone had forged his signature. Someone had deliberately falsified county records to manufacture jurisdiction over my property. I knew then that this wasn't petty HOA harassment. This wasn't about property values or aesthetic standards or any of the sanctimonious nonsense Karen had been spouting. This was organized fraud, carefully planned, deliberately executed, and criminal in both intent and action. The question was, why? Why go through this much effort to claim authority over one old cabin? The answer came 3 days later when I found a real estate listing from 2020, before the HOA was even formed. Karen's husband, David Whitmore, owned a development company called Lakefront Improvements, LLC. They'd submitted plans to the county for a luxury resort development spanning 60 acres, including waterfront access for boat launches, a marina, and private beaches. The proposed site? My 40 acres. My land was the keystone property they needed for their multi-million-dollar development plan. The HOA harassment wasn't random cruelty. It was a calculated strategy to force me to sell at distressed prices so they could complete their vision of transforming this wild shoreline into another generic luxury resort. Everything clicked into place with the cold precision of a circuit board finally receiving power. The forged surveys, the manufactured fines, the bureaucratic sabotage. Karen wasn't just a petty dictator drunk on clipboard authority. She was a criminal protecting a financial scheme worth millions. I sat back in my chair, the weight of this discovery settling over me like a physical presence. My grandfather's cabin wasn't just my inheritance anymore. It was the only thing standing between wild shoreline and commercial exploitation, between natural beauty and another parking lot. The loons called across the dark water, their voices carrying the same haunting melody my grandfather had fallen asleep to for 40 years. I looked at the framed photo on my wall. Frank Lawson standing in front of this cabin the year it was completed, hands calloused from work, face proud and weathered. "I won't let them win, Grandpa," I said to the empty room. "Not while I'm still breathing." That night, I didn't sleep. I organized every document, every map, every piece of evidence into a comprehensive file. The real battle wasn't going to be fought with anger or confrontation. It was going to be fought with the truth. Word spread to the lake community faster than wildfire through August dry timber. Within days of my property research discovery, the neighborhood split into two distinct camps with the precision of a fracture line running through granite. Half the neighbors, mostly retirees living in the new lakefront mansions, people who'd paid $800,000 to $1.2 million for their homes and who attended every HOA meeting like it was church, sided with Karen without question. They believed her carefully constructed narrative about environmental violations, safety hazards, and one selfish man destroying property values for everyone. I'd overhear their conversations at the marina when I came to check on my kayaks. That Lawson cabin is a blight on the whole lake, one woman said, voice dripping with particular disdain wealthy people reserve for anything that doesn't meet their aesthetic standards. My property value has probably dropped $50,000 just having to look at that shack every morning. The other camp, working-class families, a few long-time residents who remember my grandfather, and people who understood what HOA overreach looked like, whispered their support but kept their heads down. They'd learned through bitter experience that opposing Karen meant becoming her next target. My mailbox filled with anonymous notes, slipped in after dark by neighbors too afraid to speak publicly. Don't fight her, Ethan. She'll ruin you like she ruined the Hendersons. Karen destroyed my landscaping business by spreading lies. Please just sell and move on. She's got connections at the county. You can't win. The fear in those notes was palpable. Each word carrying the weight of previous battles lost, of lives disrupted by a woman wielding a clipboard like a weapon of mass destruction. Then Karen went digital, launching a social media campaign with the sophistication of a political operative. A Facebook group called Save Our Lake appeared overnight, filled with professionally shot photographs of my cabin. Angles carefully chosen to make 64 years of honest weathering look like criminal neglect. Posts claimed my unsafe structure was leaching toxins into pristine waters and endangering children who swim nearby. The comments section became a cesspool of manufactured outrage. This is disgusting. How is this allowed? The county needs to condemn this property immediately. Most of the accounts were less than 3 months old. Generic profile pictures, suspicious posting patterns that scream coordinated campaign rather than organic community concern. I woke one morning to find drone footage of my property posted online. Aerial views with ominous music and a narrator explaining how one man's selfish refusal to comply with community standards threatens everyone's investment. The video had 3,400 views and had been shared 47 times before I even saw it. The isolation hit harder than I expected. People I'd helped over the years, neighbors whose docks I'd rewired for free, whose boats I'd repaired, whose kids I'd taught to fish, now avoided eye contact when they saw me at the general store. Conversations stopped when I entered rooms. Invitations to community events dried up completely. Even Tom Keller, my old fishing buddy and one of my few remaining allies, faced pressure. His wife worked at the real estate office where Karen had connections. Tom, I support you standing by Ethan, she told him one night at dinner, voice strained with worry. But Karen called my boss today. She's threatening to pull her listings if the office doesn't distance itself from problem properties. I could lose my job. The social pressure was designed to break me, to make me feel like the villain in a story where I was simply trying to keep what my grandfather had built. Karen understood that humans are social creatures, that isolation can be as destructive as any legal harassment. What would you do if your neighbors chose silence over justice? If the people you'd helped turned their backs because standing beside you meant becoming the next target? Drop a comment below. I genuinely want to know, because this part of the battle tested me in ways I hadn't expected. Late one evening, sitting on my dock watching the sun paint the water gold and crimson, I heard footsteps behind me. Dorothy Marsh, 73 years old, widow of a logger who'd worked these forests for 40 years, approached slowly with a covered dish in her hands. Ethan, I brought you some casserole, she said quietly. And I want you to know, not everyone believes her lies. Some of us remember when this lake was for regular folks, before people with more money than sense moved in and decided they owned everything. She sat beside me, and for the first time in weeks, I didn't feel completely alone. She did this to the Hendersons 3 years ago, Dorothy continued. harassed them until they sold their cabin for half what it was worth. I watched it happen and said nothing because I was afraid. I'm not staying silent this time. That conversation changed something fundamental. I realized Karen's greatest weapon wasn't her clipboard or lawyers or money. It was fear. And fear only works when people stay isolated. It was time to build an alliance. By July, Karen escalated from social pressure to bureaucratic warfare, deploying tactics that would make authoritarian regimes proud. The attacks came from multiple directions simultaneously, each one calculated to drain my resources and patience while maintaining plausible deniability. A county building inspector named Marcus Rivera arrived unannounced on a Tuesday morning, clipboard in hand, expression apologetic. "Mr. Lawson, I've got a stop work order here for unpermitted construction activity. Says you're doing major structural modifications without proper permits." I stared at him, confused. "I haven't filed for any permits because I'm not doing any construction. I replaced a light switch last week." "That's it." Marcus sighed, the sound of a man who'd seen this playbook before. "Sir, we received 17 separate complaints about your property in the last 6 weeks. The county's obligated to investigate. I'm sorry, but until we clear this up, you can't do any work whatsoever. No repairs, no modifications, nothing." When I called the county planning office, the clerk's voice carried the exhaustion of someone dealing with a flood of nonsense. "Mr. Lawson, we had anonymous complaints about illegal shoreline modification, unpermitted dock expansion, wetland contamination, septic system failures, and," she paused, clearly reading from a list, "operating an unlicensed commercial marina. We have to investigate every complaint, regardless of merit." The pattern was obvious. Karen was weaponizing the county's obligation to investigate complaints, filing false reports to create a paper trail that made me look like a serial violator of every code imaginable. That's when I hired Zoe Ramirez. 38 years old, environmental law specialist, 5'4" of focus intensity, who'd taken on corrupt developers and won. Her office smelled like coffee and old law books, walls covered with framed courtroom victories that made corporate lawyers wake up sweating. "Let me see everything," she said, spreading my documents across her conference table with the precision of a surgeon preparing for a complex operation. 3 hours later, she looked up with fire in her eyes. "Ethan, these people are criminals. The evidence photos the HOA submitted to the county." She pulled up her laptop screen. "This photo supposedly showing your dock encroaching on HOA property? It's from Lake Chelan, 100 miles north. I reverse image searched it. They literally downloaded stock photos and claimed they were your violations." She tapped another file. "This environmental report claiming you're dumping sewage into the lake? Forged signature from a biologist who retired in 2018. These building code violations? Half the codes they're citing don't exist in this county. They're from California regulations." The totality of the fraud was staggering. Every complaint, every citation, every piece of evidence was either falsified, forged, or completely fabricated. Karen had created an entire alternate reality of violations that existed only in her manufactured documents. But the fines continued escalating, now totaling $38,000 in HOA citations, plus county investigation fees, plus the cost of hiring attorneys and experts to defend against baseless accusations. My savings account was hemorrhaging money faster than I could track. Then Karen played her ace, family connections. Her cousin Brad Whitmore, a sheriff's deputy with 23 years on the force and an ego the size of his patrol car, started showing up to serve notices. He'd arrive in full uniform, hand resting on his duty belt. That particular smirk cops get when they're abusing authority they think is untouchable. "Mr. Lawson," he'd say with mock formality, handing me documents that turned out to be fake citations with no legal standing. "You might want to consider selling while you still can. My cousin's being generous, offering to buy your property at fair market value. Keep fighting, and you'll end up with nothing but legal debt." The implied threat was clear. He wore a badge. I was just a citizen, and in his mind that power dynamic meant he could intimidate me into submission. That's when I bought insurance. 8 high-definition security cameras with night vision, audio recording, and cloud backup. Every angle of my property, every approach, Every interaction, captured and time-stamped and archived where Karen's people couldn't delete or alter the evidence. The cameras caught Brad returning 3 days later to remove mail from my mailbox, a federal crime carrying up to 5 years in prison. They caught Karen's landscaping crew accidentally spraying herbicide on my flower beds. They caught midnight trespassing, property damage, and a pattern of harassment that would make prosecutors salivate. Zoe filed a comprehensive response to the county, including the forged documents, the fake photos, and affidavits from the real professionals whose signatures had been falsified. She also sent a courtesy copy to the FBI's field office, noting that the mail theft and interstate fraud Karen had used online banking meant federal jurisdiction. Here's what people don't understand about bullies, Zoe said during one of our strategy sessions, her voice carrying the wisdom of someone who'd fought these battles before. They rely on victims staying isolated, too afraid or exhausted to fight back. The moment you document everything, bring in professionals, and refuse to be intimidated, they panic. And panic makes people sloppy. Karen was about to get very, very sloppy. The county quietly dropped all their investigations after reviewing Zoe's evidence, issuing a formal letter clearing me of all alleged violations. But more importantly, the county attorney flagged Karen's complaints as potentially fraudulent, triggering their own investigation into who was filing false reports and why. The noose was tightening, and Karen could feel it. Her next moves would be driven by desperation rather than strategy. And desperate people make fatal mistakes. Justice moves slowly, grinding forward with the patience of glaciers carving mountains. But veterans of long campaigns know something bureaucrats don't. Sometimes the slowest approach wins a war, because it builds foundations that can't be shaken. My old fishing buddy Tom Keller became the first official member of what we'd later call Operation Grandpa's Legacy. Retired police detective, 32 years on the force. The kind of investigator who could spot patterns in chaos and follow evidence trails that led to places criminals thought were safely hidden. "Ethan, let me watch your security footage," he said one evening, settling into my grandfather's rocking chair with a tumbler of whiskey and the focused intensity of a hunter tracking prey. I've seen intimidation campaigns before. There's always a pattern, always mistakes they don't realize they're making. He spent 2 nights reviewing hundreds of hours of footage, taking notes in his detective's notebook that he carried for 3 decades. On the 3rd morning, he called me over to the laptop screen, pointing at a timestamp. 2:47 a.m., watch this. He said, playing footage of Brad Whitmore in civilian clothes, no uniform, using a key to open my mailbox and remove envelopes. That's a federal crime, brother. Title 18, United States Code, Section 1708. Mail theft carries up to 5 years in federal prison. Your cousin-in-law, the cop, just handed us leverage that could destroy his career. Meanwhile, Zoe was conducting her own investigation through public records that required a law degree to navigate. She spent days in the county clerk's office, the assessor's database, and state contractor licensing boards, following money trails that wound through shell companies and falsified business registrations. "Ethan, look at this," she said during an emergency meeting in my cabin, spreading financial documents across the table like a prosecutor building a RICO case. The HOA's annual budget shows $312,000 paid to a company called Lakefront Improvements, LLC, for beautification projects and emergency repairs. But when I checked state contractor licensing records, that company registered to David Whitmore, Karen's husband, but they have no contractor's license, no business insurance, and no employees. She pulled up more files. Every payment goes into their account. Then within 48 hours, transfers to personal accounts or gets used for luxury purchases. Last month, $47,000 in emergency tree removal paid for a Mediterranean cruise. $89,000 in shoreline restoration bought them a Lexus. The scope of the fraud was breathtaking. Karen and her husband had turned the HOA into a personal ATM, embezzling hundreds of thousands of dollars from their own neighbors through fake invoices and non-existent services. But here's the beautiful part, Zoe continued, her voice carrying that particular satisfaction lawyers get when they found the killing blow in litigation. This crosses state lines because they used internet banking. It involves mail fraud because they sent falsified invoices through USPS. And the amounts Over $480,000 in 18 months. Trigger federal prosecution thresholds. This isn't just local HOA corruption anymore. This is federal felony territory. She picked up her phone. I worked with a federal prosecutor 5 years ago on an environmental case. Judge Harold Simmons, now sitting in the U.S. District Court. He hates corruption, especially the kind that exploits community organizations. Let me make a call. Dorothy Marsh became our community liaison, quietly reaching out to other neighbors who've been victimized by Karen's tactics. Within 2 weeks, she compiled testimonials from 9 families who'd faced similar harassment. Falsified fines, property damage, social pressure campaigns designed to force sales at distressed prices. The Hendersons paid $47,000 in fake HOA fines before selling their cabin for $340,000, Dorothy reported during one of our evening strategy sessions. Karen's husband's company bought it through a subsidiary, then flipped it 6 months later for $890,000. They've been running the scheme for 3 years, targeting anyone who owns property they want for their resort development. We built our alliance carefully and methodically, with the patience of people who understood that rushing to confrontation before having overwhelming evidence would give Karen the opportunity to destroy documents and manufacture defenses. Tom handled security and evidence documentation. Zoe managed the legal strategy and federal coordination. Dorothy organized community, support, and witness testimonials. And I kept living my life, maintaining my property, documenting every interaction, and refusing to be intimidated. The cameras caught everything. Late-night trespassing, property damage, threatening visits from Brad in uniform using his badge to intimidate. Every incident got tagged, time-stamped, and uploaded to cloud storage where it couldn't be destroyed or altered. We compiled a dossier thicker than a phone book. Forged surveys, falsified citations, embezzlement evidence, witness statements, financial records showing a money trail from HOA accounts to personal luxury purchases. Then Zoe made the call that would change everything. Judge Simmons will meet with us, she announced one evening, her voice tight with controlled excitement. Quietly off the record at your cabin. He wants to see the property, review the evidence, and hear your story directly. If he agrees there's probable cause, he'll coordinate with the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit. The pieces were moving into position like a chess endgame where the opponent doesn't realize checkmate is inevitable. All we had to do now was wait for Karen to make her final, fatal mistake. The investigation unfolded like a slow-motion avalanche. Silent at first, gathering momentum invisibly, until the weight of accumulated evidence became unstoppable and devastating. Judge Harold Simmons arrived at my cabin on a Thursday morning in late August, driving an unmarked sedan that looked like it belonged to a retired accountant rather than a U.S. District Court judge. 62 years old, silver hair, wire-rimmed glasses, wearing jeans and a polo shirt that let him blend into the lake community without drawing attention. His handshake was firm, his eyes sharp, and when he looked at my grandfather's cabin, I saw something unexpected: respect. Mr. Lawson, he said, voice carrying the gravitas of someone who'd spent 3 decades on the federal bench. I grew up in a cabin not much different from this one. My grandfather built it on the Columbia River in 1947. When developers tried to force my family out in the 80s, we fought for 3 years and lost. That cabin's underwater now, drowned by a dam project that should never have been approved. He paused, looking across the lake's glassy surface. I won't let that happen to you. We sat at my grandfather's hand-built table, the same table where Frank Lawson had cleaned fish and taught me to tie knots and told stories about surviving the Depression, and I walked the judge through 18 months of documentation. Every citation, every fine, every threatening letter, laid out in chronological order like a prosecutor building a case for a jury. Zoe presented the financial evidence. Spreadsheets showing money flowing from HOA accounts to shell companies, then to personal purchases. Credit card statements for luxury goods charged as community maintenance expenses. Bank records showing $480,000 in fraudulent transactions over 18 months. Tom added the criminal evidence: video footage of mail theft, trespassing, property damage, intimidation by a law enforcement officer abusing his badge. Timestamps, HD video, audio recordings that captured threats and extortion attempts in Karen's own voice. Judge Simmons studied the documents with the methodical attention of someone who'd reviewed 10,000 cases and knew how to separate legitimate claims from manufactured nonsense. After 2 hours, he removed his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. This is one of the most comprehensive documentation packages I've seen in a civil case, he said quietly. Mrs. Whitmore has committed multiple federal crimes: wire fraud, mail fraud, conspiracy to commit extortion, falsification of government document, and honest services fraud. Her husband and cousin are co-conspirators in a racketeering enterprise. The amounts involved trigger mandatory minimums under federal sentencing guidelines. He pulled out his phone. I'm going to make some calls. The FBI's Financial Crimes Unit has an office in Seattle. They'll want to coordinate with the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Western District. Your role, Mr. Lawson, is going to be continuing exactly what you've been doing. Document everything, maintain security footage, and stay visible. They need her to keep operating so they can catch additional crimes in progress. The next phase felt like being an actor in a crime drama, except the stakes were my grandfather's legacy and potentially years of my life if Karen's scheme succeeded. Federal agents began surveillance, watching Karen's movements, tracking her financial transactions, building a case that would survive appellate challenges and result in convictions that couldn't be overturned on technicalities. My role was to be the bait, to keep living my life, knowing I was being watched by both sides. Karen's people monitoring my property looking for violations to exploit. Federal agents monitoring Karen's people documenting crimes in real time. Each evening, I'd upload security footage to encrypted cloud storage that FBI forensic accountants reviewed for evidence. Tom would send his daily analysis to the investigative team, highlighting patterns and connections I might have missed. Zoe coordinated with federal prosecutors, translating my lived experience into legal language that would hold up in court. The surveillance revealed things even we hadn't known. Karen's landscaping crew included 2 men with prior convictions for property crimes, recruited specifically for intimidation work. Brad had been filing false police reports about me for months, creating a paper trail meant to support future asset seizure claims. David Whitmore's shell company had similar schemes running in 2 other counties, targeting elderly property owners near valuable waterfront development sites. When Zoe compared investigation timelines, she discovered something chilling. Every inspection by county officials at Karen had triggered corresponded to withdrawals from HOA accounts. She was literally paying bribes to government employees to harass me with fake investigations, turning public servants into weapons in her private war. Over $480,000 stolen from HOA members in 18 months. Over $127,000 in fraudulent fines levied against me and others. Over $89,000 paid in bribes to corrupt officials who were supposed to protect citizens from exactly this kind of abuse. The federal task force expanded to include IRS investigators looking at tax fraud, EPA officials examining falsified environmental reports, and the U.S. Postal Inspection Service investigating mail crimes, followed by car door slamming, followed by her heels clicking rapidly across my porch. The door exploded open. Showtime. The morning sunlight streaming through my cabin windows caught the dust mote stirred up by the door slamming against the wall, creating a momentary haze that made Karen Whitmore's dramatic entrance look almost theatrical, like a stage villain arriving for the third act confrontation. She stood in my doorway, chest heaving with exertion and rage, her carefully styled platinum hair slightly disheveled from the violent entry, her designer suit somehow making her look more ridiculous than authoritative in the rustic setting of my grandfather's hand-built cabin. Her clipboard was clutched in both hands like a shield, knuckles white with tension, face flushed crimson with the particular color of someone who's convinced their tantrum will finally get results. Mr. Lawson. Her voice came out shrill, cracking slightly on my name, the practice authority she usually wielded now edged with desperation. You are in direct violation of Subdivision Code Section 8.2, subsection D. You are hereby subject to immediate seizure property under emergency HOA enforcement powers. This construction project is shut down effective immediately. Judge Harold Simmons, seated calmly across from me at my grandfather's table with a cup of coffee steaming in his hands, turned slowly to face her. He didn't stand, didn't raise his voice, didn't make any sudden movements. He simply looked at her with the calm, measured gaze of someone who presided over federal courtrooms for 30 years and had seen every variety of human foolishness imaginable. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said quietly, each word carrying the weight of judicial authority that needed no volume to be felt. "You've just committed trespass on federal property. This cabin is currently under U.S. District Court review. Entry without permission constitutes a federal crime." The color drained from Karen's face like someone had pulled a plug. Her mouth opened, closed, open again, producing no sound as her brain tried to process information that contradicted her entire understanding of the power dynamic she thought she controlled. "I what? No, you don't understand," she stammered, taking a step backward but not yet leaving. "This man has been violating HOA regulations for 18 months. I have documentation. I have—" The sound of car doors closing outside cut her off. Through the cabin windows, we all watched as 4 individuals in dark suits with FBI credentials visible on their belts approached the porch with a purposeful stride of federal agents who'd been waiting for this exact moment. Special Agent Jennifer Moss entered first, a woman in her mid-40s with short dark hair and the no-nonsense demeanor of someone who'd spent 20 years investigating white-collar crime. She held up her credentials for Karen to see clearly. "Mrs. Whitmore, I'm Special Agent Moss with the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit. We've been investigating allegations of wire fraud, mail fraud, and conspiracy to commit extortion related to the Lakeshore States Homeowners Association. We need you to step outside, please." Karen's face cycled through emotions faster than a slot machine: shock, confusion, anger, fear, denial, settling finally on desperate defiance. "This is harassment. This is a setup. You can't. I have rights. My attorney." Zoe stood from her chair, her voice cutting through Karen's panic with surgical precision. "Mrs. Whitmore, you entered private property without permission while it was under federal court protection. You've been observed on security footage committing multiple acts of trespass, vandalism, and intimidation over the past 18 months. The FBI has been investigating your financial crimes for the past 4 months. You have the right to remain silent. I'd suggest using it." That's when Brad Whitmore, Karen's cousin, the sheriff's deputy who'd been using his badge to intimidate me for months, appeared in the doorway behind the FBI agents. He was in full uniform, hand moving toward his duty belt in what might have been instinct or might have been threat assessment, his face displaying particular confusion of someone who thought they were untouchable discovering they'd been wrong. A second FBI agent, younger, with the build of someone who spent serious time in the gym, stepped forward with his own credentials visible. "Deputy Whitmore, we have video evidence of you stealing mail from Mr. Lawson's mailbox on multiple occasions. Federal crimes under Title 18, U.S. Code, Section 1708. We also have documentation of you filing false police reports and abusing your authority as a law enforcement officer. You need to surrender your duty weapon immediately." The room fell into a silence so profound I could hear the coffee percolating in my grandfather's old pot, the distant call of a loon across the lake, the gentle creak of floorboards as people shifted weight. The entire confrontation had lasted less than 3 minutes, but those minutes contained the collapse of Karen's entire criminal enterprise. Agent Moss produced a folded document from her jacket pocket. "Karen Whitmore, you're under arrest for wire fraud, mail fraud, conspiracy to commit extortion, falsification of government documents, and obstruction of justice. David Whitmore, your husband, is being arrested at your residence simultaneously. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be provided for you." The metallic click of handcuffs closing around Karen's wrists was the most satisfying sound I'd heard in 18 months. She didn't struggle, didn't scream, didn't do anything except stare at the floor as reality crashed down around her like the fraudulent empire she'd built. Brad fared worse. When Agent Moss's partner, Agent Rodriguez, asked for his duty weapon, Brad made the catastrophic mistake of hesitating, of looking like he might resist. 2 more agents appeared from outside, and within seconds he was face down on my porch, being handcuffed and read his rights while his sheriff's department credentials were removed and bagged as evidence. Judge Simmons stood finally, walking to the door to observe the arrest, his expression neutral, but his eyes carrying satisfaction that justice was being served in exactly the way it should be, methodically, legally, with overwhelming evidence and proper procedure. "Mr. Lawson," he said, turning back to me, "thank you for your patience during this investigation. Your grandfather would be proud. This cabin will remain in your family where it belongs." Through the window, I watched as FBI agents led Karen and Brad to separate vehicles. Neighbors who'd been keeping their distance for months now appeared on their porches, watching the arrest, some with satisfaction, others with a dawning realization that they'd been victims too. Dorothy Marsh stood at the edge of my property, arms crossed, face set with grim satisfaction. When Karen was placed in the FBI vehicle, Dorothy nodded once, a gesture of respect for justice finally arriving. The smell of fresh coffee mixed with the morning lake air and the scent of my grandfather's pine logs, creating a moment that felt both surreal and absolutely right. After 6 months of torment, of harassment, of fighting to keep what my family had built, the battle was finally over. But the real story, the lessons about standing up to bullies, about documentation and patience, about communities finding courage, that story was just beginning. 3 months after Karen's arrest, winter sunlight streamed through courtroom windows, casting long shadows across polished wood and brass railings that had witnessed countless moments where justice either triumphed or failed. Today it triumphed. The federal courthouse in Seattle was packed with people whose lives had been touched by Karen Whitmore's criminal enterprise, victims seeking vindication, neighbors seeking closure, journalists documenting the fall of a suburban tyrant who believed her clipboard granted immunity from consequences. Karen sat at the defense table in an orange jumpsuit that stripped away all pretense of the authority she'd wielded for years, her platinum hair now showing dark roots, her face bare the makeup she'd worn like war paint. Her husband David sat beside her in matching orange, both of them diminished, reduced to what they'd always been beneath the designer clothes and luxury vehicles. Common criminals who exploited community trust for personal gain. U.S. District Judge Harold Simmons presided, the same man who'd sat at my grandfather's table drinking coffee, while Karen incriminated herself. His voice carried the weight of federal authority as he reviewed the charges. The defendants had pled guilty to 6 counts of wire fraud, 4 counts of mail fraud, 3 counts of conspiracy to commit extortion, 2 counts of falsifying government documents, and 1 count of obstruction of justice. The evidence presented during plea negotiations had been overwhelming, so comprehensive that even Karen's expensive attorneys had advised immediate guilty pleas to secure reduced sentences. The alternative was a jury trial where federal prosecutors would parade 18 months of documentation, video evidence, witness testimony, and forensic accounting that left zero room for reasonable doubt. Mrs. Whitmore. Judge Simmons continued, his voice measured but carrying unmistakable contempt. You systematically exploited your position of trust within the Lakeshore States community. You embezzled $480,000 from your neighbors, filed false charges against innocent people, corrupted public officials, and attempted to destroy a family's generational property through fraud and intimidation. This court finds your conduct not merely criminal, but morally reprehensible. He adjusted his glasses, consulting the sentencing guidelines with the thoroughness of someone who understood these decisions would affect multiple lives. You are hereby sentenced to 9 years in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised release. You will pay $685,000 in restitution to your victims, including $127,000 to Ethan Lawson for fraudulent fines and damages. Your assets will be liquidated to satisfy these obligations. David Whitmore received 7 years for his role in the financial fraud scheme. Brad Whitmore, the deputy who'd abused his badge, lost his law enforcement certification permanently and received 3 years for mail theft and official misconduct. The courtroom erupted in quiet satisfaction. Not celebration, because good people don't celebrate others' downfall, but relief that accountability had finally arrived. Outside the courthouse, Dorothy Marsh gathered 12 families who'd been victimized by Karen's schemes over the years. Together, they recovered over $340,000 in restitution, money that had been stolen through fake fines, forced property sales, and fraudulent HOA assessments. This never would have happened if Ethan had given up. Dorothy told a local news reporter covering the sentencing. One man's refusal to be intimidated saved an entire community. Back at Lake Ashbury, The transformation was profound. The Lakeshore Estates HOA dissolved completely, its charter revoked, its assets distributed among members who'd been defrauded. The community voted to create a new voluntary association without mandatory dues, without enforcement powers, without the authoritarian structure that had enabled Karen's crimes. Neighbors I hadn't spoken to in months came by my cabin with handshakes, apologies, and homemade pies that tasted like reconciliation. We were cowards, one man admitted, standing on my dock watching the sunset paint water gold and crimson. We saw what she was doing, knew it was wrong, but stayed silent because we were afraid. Thank you for having the courage we lacked. Property values actually increased after the HOA dissolved. Turns out potential buyers prefer communities governed by mutual respect rather than authoritarian fear. Real estate agents began using our story as an example of what happens when neighborhoods choose cooperation over control. Now, each morning, I sit on my rebuilt dock, coffee steaming in mountain air that tastes like freedom, watching loons glide across water that reflects towering pines and endless sky. The frame court order hangs inside my cabin. United States versus Whitmore, a reminder that bullies only win when good people stay silent. I've started teaching workshops on property rights and HOA abuse, helping other people facing similar situations. Tom provides security consulting, Zoe offers legal advice, and Dorothy organizes community support networks. We've turned our battle into resources for others fighting the same war. My grandfather's cabin stands exactly as he built it, protected now not just by property law, but by a community that learned the cost of silence and the power of standing together against corruption. So what would you do if your HOA tried to destroy your life? Would you fight back, or would you surrender? Drop your answer below, and hit subscribe for more true stories of ordinary people defeating extraordinary corruption. Because justice isn't just something that happens in courtrooms. Justice is what we build when we refuse to let bullies win.